Daniel Wayne Geyer, age 9, and Christopher Scott Weaver, age 7, were two young boys from Virginia Beach in the state of Virginia, USA. The pair were good friends and often played together. Their families both lived on Poughkeepsie Court on the Wadsworth housing complex, which was military housing for US Navy personnel, and they didn't live far from one another. Both boys also attended the same school, Birdneck Elementary. On the afternoon of March 4th, 1991, at around 4:30 p.m, both Daniel and Scott, as he was more commonly known, decided to go for a ride on their bikes together, something the pair did quite often. The boys were last seen at a grocery store at approximately 5:30 p.m. that evening. However, when they failed to return home as darkness fell, the Geyer and Weaver families knew that something was wrong. They searched around the area for the boys, flashlights in hand, scouring the usual spots where they would play, including the woods and near to Birdneck Lake, where they had ventured a week prior, much to their parents' dismay. Both Daniel and Scott were warned not to venture near Birdneck Lake because it was dangerous, but according to Scott's grandmother, they were there just days prior. According to many children who lived in the area, the woods and lake were commonly referred to as their playground, as there were old skateboarding ramps, forts and tree houses dotted about the woods. Many children loved to look for turtles in the lake and loved to swim there. Concerned parents, on the other hand, didn't see the area as a playground, but as somewhere which posed many dangers to their children, as it was a place reportedly frequented by delinquents and vagabonds, according to the Roanoke Times newspaper. One youth in particular was often seen drinking and smoking there also, spray painting pentagrams on trees, and was known to chase the children. Though this frightened some, most viewed this mysterious teen as a big brother who often played with them, despite him being, quote, a bit weird. Initial worries for the boys were that they had perhaps gotten into difficulty by the lake, and as a result, the families reported Daniel and Scott missing to local authorities at 7:40 p.m. The search for the boys was extensive, with police, Navy personnel, American Red Cross and local volunteers scouring the vicinity for any sign of Geyer and Weaver. After almost 24 hours with no trace of the boys having been found, authorities narrowed their sights on an area of woodland by Birdneck Lake, where they found the boys' bikes, one partially submerged in the lake with one of the tires badly bent and the other stuck in marshland near the shallows. Following this discovery, search and rescue divers used specialist equipment to search the water, with helicopters, tracking dogs and police on horseback searching through the woodland for any clues as to the boys' whereabouts. Search units continued to explore the area for clues, and just minutes before calling off the search as night began to fall, at approximately 4:40 p.m, a grim discovery was made. During an arm's-breadth search in a thicket near General Booth Boulevard, a volunteer saw a child's hand protruding from a pile of leaves, immediately alerting authorities. They had discovered Daniel Geyer and Scott Weaver lying side by side, their fully clothed bodies concealed by leaves and debris. Both boys had large, gaping wounds to their necks, seemingly from a savage knife-wielding attack. The injuries had been inflicted with such force that 7-year-old Scott had almost been decapitated. Given the circumstances in which both boys were found, police immediately launched a homicide investigation. However, given the evidence found at the scene and no signs of a struggle, it appeared that both children had been killed elsewhere before being dumped in the woods. Daniel's parents, Gary and Valerie, as well as Scott's father, Robert, were distraught following the find. Robert had to inform his wife, Tammy, who was serving in the Navy in the Persian Gulf at the time, that her eldest son was dead. Autopsies were conducted on Daniel and Scott, which revealed that both had been stabbed and cut at multiple times, both suffering blunt force trauma. Neither boy had been victim to sexual assault. After the shocking discovery of the boys' bodies was made, locals became fearful for their own children, who often ventured to Birdneck Lake to play. Children reiterated this, the murders leaving many too afraid to ever go back there. While investigating the crime, suspicion fell upon a 16-year-old boy named Sean Paul Novak, a student at First Colonial High School who often mowed the grass of the housing complex where Geyer and Weaver's families lived. Novak allegedly began bragging to classmates that he had found Daniel and Scott's bodies and would share explicit details regarding their conditions, including the gruesome detail that their throats had been slashed. By this point, specific details regarding what injuries had been inflicted on the two boys had been withheld from the public. Classmates didn't initially find this admission particularly concerning, as Sean often exaggerated and made up stories to get attention. Police ended up speaking to the male volunteer who found the bodies, and he confirmed that Sean had not been present when the discovery was made. Many found Sean to be a strange boy, eccentric and yet very intelligent. Novak came from an extremely religious family and had a penchant for hurting and killing animals, often holding on to pieces of their bodies as trophies which he would sport around his neck. He would often try to frighten his classmates by taunting them with small animal carcasses and bones, and when that stopped scaring them, he would go one step further, purely to shock them. Novak always seemed to have intriguing yet sometimes disturbing stories to tell, with many of the children in the neighbourhood becoming somewhat fascinated by this strange individual. Interestingly, Sean was identified as the troublesome youth who often ran riot in the woods when younger children would play there, and initially, before bragging to classmates, police wanted to speak to him as a person of interest regarding the murders of Daniel and Scott. Novak was subsequently arrested on the day of Daniel Geyer's funeral and was held without bond pending a court hearing on March 11th, which was to determine whether the teen would be tried as a minor or as an adult. It was concluded that he would face a criminal trial as an adult. It came to light during Novak's questioning that he was obsessed with Dungeons and Dragons, and he claimed that the woods had become somewhat a fantasy land of his own. He referred to Daniel Geyer as a, quote, kender, a small-boned, green dwarf-like creature with pointy ears. He apparently referred to all of the children who played in the woods as these dwarven beings. On the afternoon of March the 5th, 1991, Sean spent time in the Birdneck woods, as he often did, before engaging in conversation with Daniel and Scott, whom he had previously become acquainted with. The boys were fascinated by Novak's strange personality and hobbies, and according to Novak's testimony, Daniel started asking him about a knife he had in his possession, a buck knife with a bone handle. Daniel allegedly wanted to wield it, but Sean refused. It was at this point that Daniel and Scott managed to snatch the knife from Novak, which then engulfed him with a blinding rage. Daniel kept bugging me about wanting to see my knife, and Daniel had got out my knife and I freaked out, and then Scott began to scream. I wasn't mad, I was really scared because I had cut him from the ear. As he lifted the knife from his pocket, I grabbed him by the back of his shirt and I dragged him back and I stabbed him 4 times, and I slashed him too. Following the killings, Sean placed the bodies beside one another and covered their remains with pine branches and leaves. Novak admitted that his clothes were drenched in blood, as were his hands. He cleaned himself up and washed his hands in a puddle before fleeing the scene. Given these admissions and the evidence collected by investigators, Sean Novak was charged with 2 counts of capital murder and was placed on trial a year later in March 1992. The most likely punishment for him was to be either life imprisonment or capital punishment, newspapers citing the likeliness that he would meet his demise on the electric chair and would be the youngest person in Virginia to do so, but as it transpired, this was not the case. At the trial, Novak's lawyer presented insanity as a defence, stating that their client had felt he had watched the crime unfold from above and looking down, almost as if it was an out-of-body experience. Doctors who evaluated him declared it likely that the teenager was suffering from schizophrenia, and that the darker side of his dual personality had taken over him, many stating he was, quote, possessed, but many did not buy this. The prosecution presented many witnesses who attested that Novak was not mentally ill, despite having macabre fascinations with dead animals, and the fact he appeared to believe he was in a fantasy land similar to that of Dungeons and Dragons. They were of the firm opinion that Sean had murdered in cold blood and was entirely sane when doing so. It was difficult to determine whether the crime had been premeditated. However, it's interesting to note that, upon a search of Novak's home, it was found that he possessed a number of newspaper clippings about murders and had a book about serial killers, which he had taken out of a local library a short time prior to the slayings. One witness even testified to Novak's fiery temper when, on one occasion when he was spending time at a friend's house, his mother, who was the witness, refused them permission to watch a film about infamous murderer and cult leader Charles Manson, which angered Novak. When she asked him why he was so upset, Sean said he, quote, idolised Manson. This witness saw Novak with Daniel and Scott at approximately 5:15 on March 4th outside a fast food restaurant, a short time prior to their deaths, according to police. She offered them a ride home, but Daniel told her he had to collect his bike from the woods first. Novak displayed no remorse at the trial and appeared very impassive throughout the week. When the subsequent verdict was delivered, he had nothing to say. The verdict was reached on March the 10th, 1992. The jury took only 90 minutes of deliberations to find the now 17-year-old Sean Novak guilty of murdering 9-year-old Daniel Geyer and 7-year-old Scott Weaver, a crime which the prosecutor described as, quote, merciless, bloodthirsty, and butchery. In April, Novak was sentenced to life imprisonment of 40 years to life, with a minimum time of 25 years behind bars before being able to apply for parole. He was first put up for parole in 2012, however was rejected. Geyer and Weaver's parents managed to convince the parole board not to hear Novak's case for 3 years. A number of petitions were posted in 2015 when Novak was due to be reviewed again for parole. However, no further updates have been published in the media since, so we can only assume that parole has continued to be denied to Novak. Despite justice having been served, both Geyer and Weaver families will have to revisit the parole board every 3 years in order to keep Sean Novak behind bars until he dies. It's difficult to imagine how any family can even begin to move on from such a tragedy. We can only hope that both families will find some sort of comfort in the fact that both Daniel and Scott will never be forgotten.